Oklahoma has thousands of ghost towns, more than almost anywhere else in the country. Some didn't last. Others were slowly erased until nothing was left. If you've lived in Oklahoma long enough, you've been closer to one than you think. These are 13 you weren't supposed to find. The second town will blow your mind. Number 13. Picher, Ottawa County. Picher used to be one of the most important towns in the country, and most people who live in Oklahoma have no idea why. If you've ever been through this part of Oklahoma, there's a good chance you passed right by it without even knowing. All around the area, there are massive piles covering the land, stretching for miles, and they're the reason this town is gone. At one point, this place was producing more metal than almost anywhere else in America, even during World War I and World War II, and people moved in fast to be part of it. By 1926, over 14,000 people were living in Picher. But when the mines shut down, everything changed. The pumps stopped, the tunnels filled with water, and that water became toxic. It spread into nearby streams and killed everything in it, while families were still living right next to it and raising their kids there. By the 1990s, 35% of the children had dangerous levels of lead in their blood. Then in 2008, a powerful tornado hit the town, destroying homes and killing residents, and after that, the government began buying people out. By 2009, Picher was officially gone. A few people tried to stay as long as they could, but eventually even they had to leave. The piles are still there, and the water tower still says Picher, but the people are gone. Number 12. Ingalls, Payne County. For months in 1893, the Doolin-Dalton gang, the most wanted outlaws in the American West, ate at the tables of Ingalls, Oklahoma Territory, slept in its hotel, and used the town as their base between bank and train robberies. The residents knew, every single one of them, and not one said a word to the law. The U.S. Marshal's own report explained why. The entire community was living under duress. Gang members with names like Dynamite Dick, Arkansas Tom, and Bitter Creek Newcomb received advance warning of any martial movements in the area. In exchange, they kept their violence pointed somewhere other than Ingalls. That arrangement ended on September 1st, 1893, when 14 deputy marshals rode in to make arrests. What followed was the Battle of Ingalls, bloodier than the gunfight at the OK Corral, and one of the deadliest confrontations in the history of the U.S. Marshal Service. 3 deputies died, 2 bystanders were killed. The gang shot their way to the livery stable and rode free into the prairie. The only outlaw caught, Arkansas Tom Jones, firing a rifle from a second-story hotel window, gave up only when deputies threatened to throw dynamite into the building. Every member of the Doolin-Dalton gang was eventually hunted down. Every one of them died violently. After the battle, most Ingalls residents packed up and left, saying the town would never recover from what happened here. They were right. A historical marker on Highway 51, 9 miles east of Stillwater, is what remained. The stone in the grass marking the hotel site is still there, the only thing that didn't leave. Number 11. Guthrie, Logan County. At noon on April 22, 1889, Guthrie was a railroad water stop with almost no one living in it. By 6 o'clock that evening, 10,000 people called it home. That is not a figure of speech. The land run of 1889 opened 2 million acres of Indian territory to settlement at noon on the dot. People ran on horseback, in wagons, on foot, all arriving at Guthrie in the same 6-hour window. By nightfall, the ground was covered in tents, and within months, brick and sandstone Victorian buildings lined every block, and underground parking garages for horses and carriages had already been dug beneath the streets. A city so determined to be permanent, it was building infrastructure underground before it had finished building above ground. Guthrie became Oklahoma's territorial capital, then its first state capital, in 1907. It called itself the Queen of the Prairie. 3 years later, Oklahoma City stole it. Voters chose Oklahoma City as the new capital by 3-1 in June 1910. The governor signed the transfer at midnight that same night, and his secretary drove the official state seal out of Guthrie in an automobile at full speed, a wild 30-mile run in the dark, while the Logan County Sheriff was being held on the governor's orders specifically to stop that from happening. Guthrie woke up June 12th without a government, without a capital, without a future. It began draining away. What saved it was the very thing that should have killed it. Nothing came to replace what left. Because Guthrie stopped growing after 1910, its Victorian buildings were never torn down for something modern. Over 2,000 original structures survive today, the largest contiguous historic district on the National Register of Historic Places, a capital stolen overnight, preserved by its own failure for the next 100 years. Number 10. Boggy Depot, Atoka County. The name of the state of Oklahoma came from a ghost town. Boggy Depot was founded in 1837 by Choctaw and Chickasaw settlers who had just survived the Trail of Tears. It grew into a major trading hub on the Texas Road, a stop on the Butterfield Overland Mail route running from St. Louis to San Francisco, and the principal Confederate supply depot in Indian Territory during the Civil War. By the 1850s, it was one of the most important communities in the entire territory. It was also home to Choctaw Chief Allen Wright. In 1866, federal officials asked him what the new territory should be called. Wright put two Choctaw words together, Okla, meaning people, and Humma, meaning red, Oklahoma. The word on every license plate, every highway sign, every state flag in the country, coined by a man in a ghost town in Atoka County who is now buried in its cemetery. The railroad ended it. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway laid its tracks 12 miles east of Boggy Depot in 1872, straight through a new town called Atoka. Everything followed the tracks. The Boggy Depot post office closed in 1883. Within 2 decades, the town was gone. Allen Wright's great-great-grandson carries the same name today. He plans to be buried in that Boggy Depot cemetery, in the town that gave Oklahoma its name and got nothing in return. Number 9. Texola, Beckham County. Before Texola had a name, nobody could agree on what state it was in. The town sits barely 1 mile east of the Texas border, right on the 100th meridian. Because that line proved so difficult to measure precisely in the early 1900s, the town was formally surveyed 8 times. Some surveys placed it in Oklahoma, some in Texas. For years, residents woke up without knowing for certain which state's laws applied to them. Some were legally Oklahomans 1 week and Texans the next without moving a step. Oklahoma eventually won. The town worked through 3 names, Texoma, Texokla, Texola, before settling on one that acknowledged the whole confusion as its identity. Route 66 came through in the 1930s and made Texola a stop for every westbound driver in America. Population peaked at 581, then Interstate 40 bypassed Texola in 1975. Overnight, the traffic that had kept it alive was gone. Businesses closed. Population fell from 581 to under 40 over the following decades. Today, Texola has a 1-room territorial jail from 1910, a 1930s Magnolia gas station on the National Register of Historic Places, and a bar with the words, "There is no place like Texola" painted on the wall, large enough to read from across the street. Fewer than 40 people still live there. Nobody has taken that sign down. Number 8. Beer City, Cimarron County. In the 1880s, the strip of land making up the Oklahoma Panhandle had a problem. It belonged to nobody. Not Oklahoma Territory, not Kansas, not Texas. A surveying compromise after the Civil War left this narrow band, 34 miles wide, 168 miles long, outside every official state and territorial boundary. No sheriff, no court, no law of any kind. The locals called it no man's land, and in 1888 that reputation found its most honest expression, Beer City. The settlement appeared near the Kansas border and existed for one reason: nothing was illegal here because nothing was law. Cowboys pushing cattle north from Texas stopped to drink. Gamblers set up tables that never closed. Outlaws in transit rested between jobs. The whole economy was saloons, and the nearest authority had no jurisdiction to object. Beer City lasted barely 2 years. The Organic Act of 1890 folded no man's land into Oklahoma Territory, and federal law arrived essentially overnight. With law came the end of Beer City's only purpose. The saloons shut, the gamblers left, and the settlement simply evaporated. No foundation remains, no cemetery, no marker, no confirmed exact location. Historians still argue about precisely where it stood. Somewhere in Cimarron County, under the same flat sky that watched it all happen, is the spot where the lawless came for exactly as long as the map gave them permission. Number 7. Slick Creek County. In November 1920, oil was struck near a patch of Creek County farmland that had no name and no town. By the end of 1921, 5,000 people lived there. The place was called Slick, and it had everything. Within months, lease brokers, roughnecks, merchants, families, saloons, hotels, a post office, brick buildings where there had been grass. Every single piece of it was built for one reason: the oil strike. Not the town, not the community, not any long-term plan, just the oil. By the early 1930s, the surface oil was gone, and the economics of drilling deeper didn't add up. The companies left first, workers followed. The businesses that had served them had nobody left to serve. 5,000 people became almost nothing inside one decade. Slick today is a street grid going back to grass, a few walls still standing, and a rusted water tower that marks where the center of town used to be. It was built for one thing, it ran on that one thing, and it ended exactly when that one thing ran out. Number 6. Boley, Okfuskee County. In 1905, Booker T. Washington visited Boley, Oklahoma, and called it the most enterprising and in many ways the most interesting of the Negro towns in the United States. Washington had seen a lot. He was not easily impressed. Boley was founded in 1903 by black settlers who wanted a town that white institutions couldn't touch. No white city council, no white police, no white bank deciding who got credit. By 1911, it had 4,000 residents and was the largest self-governing all-black town in America. What made it extraordinary wasn't just its size, it was that Boley had built an entire city economy from the ground up, with the first black-owned bank in the country to receive a national federal charter, meaning it operated on the exact same legal footing as any white bank in America. Then came everything at once: the Great Depression, cotton prices that collapsed, the Dust Bowl, and a state government that had been working against black economic independence since Oklahoma's very first legislative session in 1907. Boley declared bankruptcy in 1939. In 1932, Pretty Boy Floyd's partner, George Birdwell, walked into the Farmers and Merchants Bank with 2 accomplices to rob it. The bookkeeper pulled a shotgun from the vault and shot Birdwell dead before he reached the door. Boley still runs its Memorial Day rodeo, one of the oldest African-American rodeos in the country, but the population has dropped to around 500. Pecan Street sits mostly empty, and the bank that stopped an armed robbery is slowly falling apart in the sun. If this kind of Oklahoma history matters to you, subscribe. We're here every week. Number 5. Woodville, Marshall County. In the spring of 1944, the town of Woodville, Oklahoma ceased to exist, not because of a drought or a disaster, because the water simply came and nobody had the power to stop it. Woodville sat near the confluence of the Red and Washita rivers in Marshall County, a quiet farming and ranching community that had grown out of Chickasaw Nation land, built over generations by families who had been there long enough to have great-grandparents buried in the local cemetery. When the Army Corps of Engineers completed Denison Dam in 1944, the resulting reservoir, Lake Texola, covered 93,000 acres. Woodville went under, along with its school, its church, every street, every foundation that hadn't been moved in time. For nearly 70 years, the town sat silent under the water. Then, in 2011, a severe drought dropped Lake Texoma's levels dramatically. Headstones rose out of the silt along the shoreline. Foundations appeared in water shallow enough to wade through. People who had been small children the last time they saw Woodville stood at the water's edge and recognized the shapes of their town coming back. The drought ended. The lake refilled. Woodville went under again. A settlement called New Woodville exists on higher ground nearby, but the original, the cemetery, the school foundation, the street where the church stood, is still down there, waiting for the water to drop low enough to surface one more time. Number 4. Kusa, Okmulgee County. In 1916, the newspaper serving Kusa, Oklahoma, ran a headline that said simply, "No place for an idler." Kusa had every reason for that confidence. A working coal mine, 3,500 residents, banks, movie theaters, hotels, and its own paper, calling it the most promising city in the new state of Oklahoma. The mine was real, the money was real, and nobody in Kusa saw any reason it wouldn't keep going. Then the railroad chose Henrietta. When planners routed the rail line east of Kusa through the neighboring town of Henrietta instead, the logic that held Kusa together snapped. Coal couldn't move without the rail. Goods couldn't come in. Businesses that depended on rail access began closing, and residents moved toward the tracks. The coal mine ran out eventually anyway, but by the time it did, the town was already empty. Today, a few stone ruins sit in the fields east of Henrietta, and old ledger books in a local historian's collection are about all that documents Kusa's existence. The paper that called this place the most promising city in Oklahoma is now the loudest proof it ever existed at all. Number 3. North Forktown, Muscogee County. Some towns don't disappear from floods or oil busts. Some are simply declared over by a government that never wanted them to exist in the first place. North Forktown was built in the 1830s along the North Fork of the Canadian River by Muscogee Creek people who had been forcibly removed from Alabama and Georgia. Over the next 60 years, it became one of the principal towns of the Creek Nation, governing itself under Creek law, with Creek courts, Creek institutions, and Creek authority. For more than 6 decades, American law did not apply inside it. The Creek people had been forced here by the U.S. government. What they built here, they built entirely on their own terms. That's what made it a target. The Federal Dawes Act of 1887 began breaking up communal tribal land into individual allotments. By 1906, a year before Oklahoma statehood, the federal government formally abolished the governing structures of all 5 civilized tribes. Courts dissolved. Capitals stripped of authority. North Forktown didn't flood. It wasn't bypassed. The government that had forced the Creek people onto this land simply declared their right to govern it over, because a functioning sovereign Creek nation was incompatible with the state of Oklahoma the federal government intended to build. The site near Council Hill in Muscogee County is still marked. The river still runs beside it. Number 2. Tallahassee, Wagoner County, Oklahoma, became a state on November 16, 1907. Tallahassee had already been a community for 57 years. It is the oldest black settlement in Oklahoma, founded in 1850, the same year Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, the federal law that required the return of escaped enslaved people even from free states. Creek freedmen building a community in Indian Territory that year were building something the federal government was actively working against. The people who built it were Creek freedmen, people who had been enslaved by members of the Muscogee Creek Nation, carried to Indian Territory on the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, and who built a community of their own here once they could. What Tallahassee survived is almost impossible to list in order. The Civil War, which split Indian Territory bitterly and violently. Emancipation. The collapse of Creek sovereignty in 1906. Oklahoma statehood in 1907, which immediately brought some of the harshest Jim Crow laws in the nation, written and passed before the new state had finished unpacking. What finally hollowed it out was quieter. The Great Depression, a state law that closed small schools and bused the children elsewhere. And once the children's lives were centered somewhere else, the families followed, one by one, the way they always do. Tallahassee is still technically incorporated. A handful of families remain. The cemetery has names going back further than the state that surrounds it. 57 years before Oklahoma existed, someone chose this ground, and they are still here. Number 1. Doaksville, Choctaw County. To reach Doaksville today, you go to the Fort Towson Cemetery in Choctaw County, climb a set of stone stairs over the eastern wall, and walk a trail into the woods. What you find at the end of that trail was once the largest city in all of Indian Territory. Doaksville grew in the 1830s around a trading post that Josiah Doak had set up in advance. He had preceded the Choctaw people to Indian Territory and was ready to do business the day they arrived after being forced from their homes in Mississippi. The town expanded with the Choctaw Nation, and by 1850 it had over 30 buildings, a newspaper printed in both English and Choctaw, and was the designated capital of the Choctaw Nation, the single most important settlement in what would become the state of Oklahoma, and it was where the Civil War finally ended. On June 23, 1865, 54 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Confederate Brigadier General Stan Waddy was still fighting. A Cherokee leader and the last holdout of the Confederate cause, Waddy formally surrendered his command here at Doaksville. He was the last Confederate general to lay down arms in the entire war. The war ended in a Choctaw capital that no longer exists. After Fort Towson was abandoned in 1854, Doaksville's commercial reason for being began to fade. The Civil War devastated what remained of the regional economy. The railroad bypassed the town in 1870, and over the next 30 years, the people left. The post office closed in 1903. Archaeological excavations in the 1990s found the foundations of the hotel, the jail, the store, thousands of artifacts. A walking trail was opened in 2001. You can stand today on the ground where the capital of the Choctaw Nation stood, where the largest city in Indian Territory once rose from the banks of a creek, the place where the last shots of the Civil War finally went silent, and hear nothing but the trees. Most people have never heard of it. Most people in Oklahoma couldn't find it on a map. Drop a comment. What's your hometown? I'll add it to the list for the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.